Today we're going to Beijing and have a look at Beijing then and now, which I didn't actually write, but I did take the photographs. But first of all, I wanted to show you this little thing. It's the only thing I brought back from Beijing when I first went there in 1986. And here it is. It's an ashtray, and I got it from Beijing Maxims de Paris. It was the only one. It was the only European restaurant, non-Chinese restaurant, in Beijing at the time. And in fact, I picked it up because when I was travelling around China, taking my photographs on this travelling scholarship, when I got to Beijing, I ran into a group of Americans, and one guy said to me, he said, I said, "How are you enjoying it here in China?" He said, "I like China, but you know where I come from. I come from St. Louis, and this is just, you know, if you want to eat out, everybody's just goddamn Chinese food day in, day out." So I said, "Well, it is China, but I do know of a restaurant in Beijing that isn't Chinese food," and that's how I got this ashtray. In those days, China was very poorly understood, not just by me, by most people, and our only knowledge of it were things like Chinese restaurants, Chinese waiters, of course, the Chinese laundry, wishy-washy, you know, in the pantomimes and that sort of thing. Chinese corruption, of course, is well known, had heard about, and if you were a bit poshy, you'd heard of Peking opera, but more likely, you were more familiar with Peking duck. How did it come to pass that we had this sort of, not derogatory, but sort of down a nose look at China, as though it's a bit of, you know, it wasn't to be taken terribly seriously, because here was a country that has the oldest continuous culture in the world. It still speaks the same language, and so lots of different languages, but it's still the same continuous culture. So how did it come to pass? Well, it goes back, our attitude to China, right back to 1793, when a guy called Lord Macartney, no relation, I don't think, to the better known Macartney, was sent from London to seek trade with China. We're doing a bit of trade, the East India Company was, but they wanted to go to the top and start trading in a bigger way. So they thought, well, better to go than to go to Beijing and see the Emperor of China. And that's what happened. And he turned up, this chap, Lord Macartney, with his entourage, and he brought some presents along, some gifts. But the Chinese Emperor assumed that anybody bringing gifts from somewhere else outside the Chinese Emperor were bringing them as tribute, because that's what they were. But of course they weren't, and he was trying to show that these were the sort of things that could exchange, they could trade, they could barter. And then it struck the Chinese government and the Emperor particularly that this man Macartney had the impertinence to regard the Emperor of China as a sort of tradesman. He was sent away with a flea in his ear and with a letter for King George III, and the letter said this: from the Celestial Emperor. "Our celestial empire lacks nothing. Therefore there is no need for the manufactures of barbarians in exchange for our own produce." And he signed himself off by saying this: "So tremblingly obey and show no negligence." You can imagine how that was received at the court of St. James in London. And it led to an antagonism with China because we'd been trading into Canton, the East India Company had, but now started to push opium in there, and the Chinese didn't want that, and of course it resulted in the Opium Wars, and China being forced to cede parts of its territory, particularly its ports, to Britain, including of course Shanghai and of course Hong Kong. And but it didn't end there, because China was then dismembered, and there was an attack in the 1860s on the imperial city of Beijing itself, and a lot of the wonderful artifacts and things were carted off, and now they reside in the British Museum and elsewhere. And China really didn't run its own affairs for the next 100 years or so. There was a nationalist government and governments before that, but they were under the eye of the Western powers, who built cities like Shanghai and Hong Kong as Western entrepôts in the way that they wanted to run them. And so China was came down in the world pretty quickly. It came down pretty quickly, not just materially, but sort of philosophically as well, and morally, because China had for centuries regarded itself as a centre of the world, and the world that they saw was a sort of world with four corners of it. They didn't think it was flat like some Europeans did for a long time. They were more knowledgeable than that, but they did have the metaphor for a big place, a big flat place with four corners to it, and a square, and at the centre of that was another smaller square which controlled the rest and looked down the nose on the rest, and that was called China. And in the centre of China, metaphorically, was its capital, Beijing. And so Beijing was built on the lines of the way they imagined the world to be, with one box inside another, a bit like the Russian dolls. And that's why, we'll have a look at this, you can see China City, China's capital city, is laid out like that. Here are the walls around the city, taken in 1860. You can see these huge, the scale of the thing is enormous, these huge sort of corner towers. And I mean, when you think about the walls, I mean, we boasted about Hadrian's Wall, the Roman wall in Britain, is about 60 odd miles long. Of course, they had a wall 4,000 miles long. And of course, it's been modernised. All this has gone now, and it's been replaced by this, the modern China. And here's another picture of China. This idea of the grid. Here is the grid at the centre. Here in the centre of the grid is the grid itself. This is of Beijing, is the Imperial Palace here. And here is Tiananmen Square, the Square of Heavenly Peace. And there's one of the original gates is left here. Another gate here, but these are the big ones here. And you can see the whole thing is gridded out in the way they imagine the world, with the emperor at the centre, so you could see why he didn't want to be treated as a tradesman. Here it is now. You can see the other edifice that's been put in the middle here is Mao's tomb, the latest emperor, and there's the restored gate there. But the huge square, that's Tiananmen Square, those awful massacres took place in 1989 when the students were complaining about the lack of real democracy in China. But ironically, it's from that time that China really took off and became a force throughout the world. What happened in Beijing? Well, Beijing it was an interesting city when I first went to it, it had these things called hutongs, and there are still quite a few left, which are little narrow alleyways, also at right angles, where people lived. And then there was these huge edifices such as these gates and things and walls, and of course the imperial capital in the Forbidden City in the centre. But these hutongs were swept away throughout the 1980s, and I remember, I'm pleased that I saw some of them. There are some left, of course, and they are now made into very bijou, expensive apartments. But let's just take a look at one of those hutongs. This is how it would look, like that. But this same place I then photographed here. I took the photograph here, and that's exactly the same spot on that road now. And when the Duke of Edinburgh was there with the Queen, not long after I was there, he was shown round this place, and they were very proud of it, quite rightly, of what they'd done to modernise Beijing. And he was shown Chang'an Avenue, which is a huge avenue running through the centre, right past the Imperial Palace. He was shown that by the communist authorities. It was now 100 metres wide, still is, Chang'an Avenue, named after the ancient capital of China, Chang'an. And I'm afraid that Duke of Edinburgh took one look at it and he just said, "Ghastly." As I say, the Forbidden City, right in the centre of Beijing, centre of the world, it was a huge wooden structure, and it's been preserved. In fact, I've sat on the Emperor's throne on one occasion when we had a dinner there when I was working over there, and it's very impressive. But there's something about it that's very sort of cold as well. Let's have a look at that one. Here we are. Yes. Here's part of it in 1945. It is these all wooden structures, all of these huge, vast scale again, bigger than any palace you'd see in the West. Different halls and things, and here it is today. I photographed that. But have things changed? Well, not really. I didn't think of this sort of cod Chinese music when I was there in the Imperial City, in the Forbidden City, because it was so forbidding. And I thought more of Turandot, the opera by Puccini, which in fact has been performed at the in the Forbidden City. And of course it's about Princess Turandot, who's a very cold and cruel princess, and all her suitors, any suitor who presents himself, is given 3 riddles, and if he gets any one wrong, then he's publicly executed, murdered. It's a horrible tale, really, and it seemed to, in some ways, epitomise the cold brutality, in some ways, and the scale, the grandeur, the cold grandeur of that place. Let's see if we can do it. You might think all that's been swept away. Well, in fact it hasn't, because there's an then and now next to one another in the middle of Beijing. That's the Imperial Palace, the Forbidden City. But there's another Forbidden City that's grown up equal in size that you can't go in. In fact, I have been in it once many years ago. I stayed there but walked around, but you can't photograph inside it. And here it is on the map. This is the centre of Beijing. You see the green bit here. This is the Forbidden City, Shanghai Avenue, and this shaded area is forbidden, and that's the new Forbidden City, and that's the headquarters of the Communist Party of China, and it's where the largest country in the world is run from. Plus ça change. So, from Lord McCartney's blunder in 1793, China is back. And by the way, there were more billionaires in the city of Beijing than anywhere else on earth. Not bad.